Hi, welcome to week 5. This week we're at the start of module 3, so we're taking a bit of a change in direction from module 2, which looked at the ethical complexities of teaching, and now we're going to look at the psychological complexities of teaching. So we're taking a dive into learning theory, and this week we start by looking at learning and development. We'll be covering what is educational psychology, and I know some of you have a background in education, so this is not going to be entirely unfamiliar, and yet for others it's the first time that you've examined educational psychology perhaps. And so we have a range of learners in this course, and hopefully I can pull the bits out of psychology that are the most salient and the most useful for teachers. We're going to look at what educational psychology offers teachers, have a look at developmental psychology, and this week's an introduction. Next week we'll go into that a little bit further, and we're going to highlight 3 foundational theories of cognitive development: Piaget's stages of cognitive development model, Kohlberg's theory of moral development, and then have a look at what Vygotsky had to say about cognitive development. And we'll finish this week's lecture with critiques of staged theories of development, and why, even though I've just showed you a couple of stages of staged theories, why we can't get too wedded to such frameworks. And I'll also add where you can find more information if you feel like you need to learn a bit more about educational psychology. So let's start off. What is educational psychology? Well, simply, it's the application of the science of psychology to understanding learning. Now, this is done in a few ways. So one is that teachers can draw from the various subfields of psychology in order to understand how learning occurs in a variety of contexts. So they might be looking at developmental psychology, they might be looking at motivational psychology, organizational psychology, for example. So there's psychology is a broad field, and a number of subdisciplines have insights that can help schools and education systems understand how their students learn. Educational psychologists themselves apply theories of human development to understand individual learning and to inform the instructional process. Now, when we're talking about individual learning, we can be talking about that from a range of contexts. That can be very influenced by culture. Does the learner's culture match the culture of the school? And if not, what effect of that does that have on the learner? We can be looking at the different learning we can expect at different ages. So we know, for example, that it's very easy to learn language quite young, and difficult or different to learn languages when you're older. So the age of the learner and what they're trying to learn can have an effect on learning. And also individual learning can be affected by the fact whether that learning is taking place collectively with a bunch of people, say in a classroom, or whether it's done remotely using educational technologies. And digital technologies. So when we say individual learning, that maps to a whole bunch of different scenarios. And when we're talking about the instructional process, we're not necessarily talking about this taking place in educational settings such as early childhood, primary, secondary, or universities. We can also be talking about the instructional processes that take place in the social world or in work settings. So, for example, contemporary educational psychologists might be trying to understand, how does learning occur on social media? What social messages are being learned as people are consumers of social media? So educational psychology is quite broad. You also have educational psychologists that specialise in helping school-age students who are having difficulties with learning in school. So they might specialise in particular age groups, or they might specialise with particular learning challenges that can impact on students' learning. So they might specialise in working with students with ADHD, or who are on the autism spectrum, or have dyspraxia, for example. So there's a range of cognitive conditions that can impede students' learning, and sometimes social anxiety. There's a range of psychological processes that can be brought to bear to help students improve their learning, regardless of what those barriers are. And educational psychologists help identify those barriers and work with schools to come up with processes that help those particular individuals with their learning. So educational psychology is both an applied branch of psychology, but it's also a field of knowledge that helps inform educational processes, particularly around instructional processes that are aimed to help people learn. And what does educational psychology offer teachers, besides the fact that it trains a range of professionals that can work with teachers, such as when they have students that have special and inclusive needs? Well, it also offers teachers a variety of tools so that they can understand learning and how learning occurs in a variety of settings, what it looks like at a variety of ages. It provides insights into motivation, because if we can motivate our students to learn, they will learn better. And it also provides insights into developmentally appropriate milestones, so that we know that we can't teach 5-year-olds differential calculus, for example. We also know that we can't teach 17-year-olds the same way that we teach 5-year-olds. So educational psychology offers us some guidelines for knowing what to expect for the learners that are going to be in our classroom. And so, just to provide some examples about what educational psychology provides, I'm going to share with you from a 2015 report from the American Psychological Association of their top 20 principles of psychology for the teaching environment. I'm going to show you the top 10 principles from that report, just to show you how over the years, while there's lots of disagreement from individual studies about what learning looks like and the use of different theories, and something's reproduced in one setting and not in another, the way that those studies compile together leads to emergence of principles that have been shown to be consistent. And so we have to be discerning when it comes to educational psychology, because there's a range of things that fall under that banner, from pop psychology, which is not necessarily peer-reviewed and often has a lot of myths that people still believe, right through to highly nuanced, up-to-date articles which are quite abstract and don't necessarily apply in your future classrooms. So how do you kind of separate the sheep from the goats, so to speak? Well, one way is to go to really reputable sources like the American Psychological Association, and to find documents like this report and to see what that has to offer from teachers. And that's distilling thousands of studies into principles that have consistently been shown to make a difference. And the other is to learn how to engage with psychological research, so that you can see that what the latest research suggests around learning, because increasingly psychology is drawing from other areas such as neuroscience, looking at how the brain works and incorporating those insights into the development of advice in the area of educational psychology. Anyway, I think I've explained that enough. It's time to dive into these top 10 principles of psychology for teaching. And the first is, students' beliefs or perceptions about their intelligence and ability affect their cognitive functioning and learning. Now, one of the classic examples of this is in mathematics education, and where students think, I'm no good at maths, it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and hence they are no good at maths. So how the students feel about their own intelligence and their beliefs about their ability actually really does impact their cognitive functioning and learning. And so it's up to teachers to make every student feel that they are a capable learner. And so it might take working with some students a bit harder, because you've got to find those strategies that work for them, so that you can provide the student with that self-belief, that self-efficacy in their own ability to learn. What students already know affects their learning. And so if you have two students in class, and one's from a refugee background and the other's lives around the corner from the school, the student who lives around the corner from the school, and we're talking about a kindergarten classroom in my example, already knows how to succeed in the classroom. So they're likely to be socialised in the patterns and the expectations of life in an Australian classroom. Whereas someone who started at school, who has a refugee background, already knows a lot of things, and probably English is their second language, but they might not necessarily know that you put up your hand when you ask a question, or that you can't just leave the room to go to the toilet, that you have to get their teacher's permission. They might not know some of the things that we would consider to be pretty basic, and that we'd expect students coming into a kindergarten classroom to learn, such as the alphabet. So you can't, you need to build on what students already know for learning to be successful. So we have to strive to kind of match where they're at and build from that. And that where there's a big disjunction between what they already know and what they're trying to teach them, that learning is a lot more difficult. Students' cognitive development and learning are not limited by general stages of development. And because I highlighted this one because later in the lecture I will be giving specific examples of general stages of development. And it's important to realise that these stages are frameworks, and if a student isn't meeting those milestones, it's not that something's wrong with the student, and it's not that something's wrong with the framework, and we're better off trying to meet the needs of the student than trying to validate a particular framework. So the frameworks are a starting point for understanding where our students are likely to be at, but obviously there's individual difference, and the stages of development are not necessarily a straightforward linear path of learning and of development. Learning is based on context, so generalizing new learning to new contexts is not spontaneous. Rather, it needs to be facilitated. So this is particularly important in high school, where students' learning now takes place in a variety of contexts and is situated in a variety of disciplines. And if we're teaching students in the visual arts classroom how to be creative, that does not necessarily mean that they're going to take that learning and be creative in the history classroom, for example. So where we want those skills to be generalized, teachers have to facilitate that process of taking it outside the context in which it was learned and showing its applicability beyond that particular context. And acquiring long-term knowledge and skills is largely dependent on practice. So the reason I'm a good reader and a fast reader is because I spent hundreds and thousands of hours when I was a child reading. The reason I communicate well is because I've spent my entire life communicating. So, and that has then become long-term knowledge. So what goes on in the classroom when you initially give students when you initially teach students something new, is that it's just shared in the short-term working memory, and it takes practice for that to become long-term knowledge. And we have to be careful when we design our curriculum that we're building what's already in the long-term knowledge, and so that the new learning makes sense and can be added to that, rather than just being piecemeal abstract stuff that's not practiced, because then that won't be retained. And so we're 5 down, 5 to go. Clear, explanatory and timely feedback to your students is important for learning. And so feedback is one of these things that's been consistently shown to make a real difference. And timely means that students are given feedback while they're in the midst of what it is they're learning. And so it's really important for teachers, not just to give formal feedback on an essay, which might be a couple of lines, but to be working with the students daily. So it's that check-in, the classroom questioning becomes a form of feedback where the teacher can unpack misconceptions and address them straight away in a clear and timely fashion. So a lot of teachers work in just the conversations, in the checking in, and the look is formative feedback that helps students to do well in the summative tasks. So summative are the ones that contribute to students' grades, and formative is the informal feedback, and in the informal tasks the informal assessments where teachers can keep track of students' learning, and that can be as simple as just asking students questions. It can be looking at their work and seeing that their work reflects what the class is learning. And so the process of building in feedback into daily conversations facilitates high impact classrooms where learning is efficient. Now, one of the things that helps you get fit is feedback. And all of a sudden, everybody's wearing a Fitbit, because that gives us timely feedback on the calories we're burning, how many steps we've taken, for example. And so we're able to modify our behaviour because we're constantly getting this timely feedback. And so you can see that's another form of feedback. And feedback can happen in a variety of fashions. And some of the work that you do in your curriculum pedagogy classes is around giving appropriate feedback to students, because it's so important for their learning. Students' self-regulation assists learning, and regulatory skills can be taught. So self-regulation is the ability to regulate your emotions and your thoughts, and it's not just around regulating your behaviour in terms of, oh, I've got to do my homework, but it's in terms of regulating your behaviour and, oh, I'm not on task, I'll get back to task. I'm not listening, I'm going to get back to listening. And small children need help with their self-regulation. You know, if you're a parent, you'll know that suddenly your small child will be having a meltdown because they haven't eaten, or they're overtired, and it's up to us as the carers to be the ones that regulating them in terms of helping them get fed, get enough sleep, so that they learn. We're scaffolding them in learning that process of regulating their behaviour. And we can also, within our lessons, teach students these self-regulation skills around learning, so that they become better at knowing what it is that helps them learn and then applying it to their own learning. Students tend to enjoy learning and perform better when they are intrinsically rather than extrinsically motivated to achieve. Excuse me. So where they genuinely love the subject, they're going to perform better than where they're motivated by trying to get high grades, for example, or trying just to pass, for example. And one way of illustrating that is the fact that the visual arts elective in HSC tends to be the most popular elective. And that is because it's a course where students are very intrinsically motivated to achieve in that course, because it's about them being able to apply their particular passion and explore their thoughts about the world, rather than being as syllabus content driven as a lot of the other courses. Teachers' expectations about their students affect students' opportunities to learn, their motivations and their learning outcomes. So this one is a really important one for teachers. Excuse my cough, and I can assure you I got COVID tested last week, so it's just a tickle. I'm not contagious or anything. And I can't be bothered editing this out, so you get what you're given. As they say in my son's, you get what you get and you don't get upset, is what they say in my son's before and after school centre. And so that's like my lectures. You get what you get and you don't get upset. Although I'm upset. Anyway, in the same way that students have thoughts about their own abilities, whether they think they're good at something or not, affect how well they learn, teachers' expectations shape this as well. And you'll notice in this it says there are opportunities to learn. So where a teacher thinks someone's great at a subject, they're going to give them opportunities to extend their learning, which in turn is going to motivate the student and increase their learning outcomes. So it's very important that teachers try not to try to have high expectations for all their students, and try and know that they can take their students past where they're already at. So no, yes, obviously not all students are going to get band 6s in everything for the HSC, because it's not designed that way. But that doesn't mean all students can't succeed, and success might look differently for different students. And a big predictor of the success is the teacher's expectations. And emotional well-being influences educational performance, learning and development. So you can't learn well if you don't feel safe. And so often things like a drop in performance or grades can indicate that all is not well with students at social emotional learning. Maybe things are not going well at home. So teachers, a part of a role of a teacher is creating a safe learning environment for all of their students, so that because of their emotional well-being influences educational performance and their learning, and also their cognitive development. And so to maximise the chances of students doing well, it's important that classrooms are safe, and sometimes teachers will have to work with students to overcome some of the hardships that are happening outside the school environment. So those are the top 10 principles that psychology offers for shaping the teaching environment. And I hope that that's been useful, because these are, and at the end of this PowerPoint is a reference to the report that comes from, if you want to take a look at that, because the report's actually the top 20, but I figured for reasons of time we might just look at the top 10. And these kind of provide some ideas about how you can provide your students with a high impact learning environment. Okay, so we're now changing our attention again. We're going to look at developmental psychology. We're going to look at 3 classic theories: Piaget's cognitive development theory, Kohlberg's theory of moral development, and Vygotsky's social-cultural theory of cognitive development. And Vygotsky was a contemporary of Piaget, but he was Russian, Piaget was Swiss. And Vygotsky died at the age of 37, and Piaget didn't read Vygotsky's work until after Vygotsky's death. On the other hand, Vygotsky read Piaget and initially dismissed his work, but later came on board to it, and then his work kind of extends Piaget's in slightly different directions. But Vygotsky was working in Russia in the early 20th century, and although his work was published in English, it wasn't until about the 80s that his work started having a huge impact in educational circles, and has made a big impact in educational psychology, and is now kind of a key part of what's taught in educational psychology. And Kohlberg likewise was quite influenced by Piaget, and applied Piaget's idea of cognitive development to look at how people develop moral ideas. Now, based on the work that Daniela's done with you for the last 2 weeks, you might think about whether you agree with the Kohlberg's theory of moral development once we start unpacking it in a couple of minutes. Okay, so Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Now, Piaget was a Swiss psychologist, and a lot of his ideas were influenced from watching his nephew and his daughter. So it's worth bearing in mind as we look at this theory, which is a staged theory of cognitive development, that Piaget was working with a sample size of 2. So, keep that in mind, because educational research now is not taken very seriously, and not considered generalizable, where the sample size is so small. So, having been influenced by Piaget, I'm going to explain his theory of cognitive development using my own nieces, nephews, and children. So this is Bea. She's my niece. She's 1 year old. And so she's at what Piaget would call the sensory motor stage of cognitive development, which is when children are 0 to 2 years old. And so here, infants learn about the world through their movements and sensations. So what they feel as they move, and they touch things and they lick things, and it's their learning is through basic actions such as sucking, grasping, looking, listening. So it is very sensory, and some of the cognitive development that occurs, and a vast amount of learning occurs in the first 2 years of a child's life. And they learn that things don't exist even when they can't. Things continue to exist even when the child can't see them. They learn to differentiate between the people and the objects around them. So one of the key learning points is when they learn that they are not their mother, that they're 2 separate entities. And they realize that their actions can cause things to happen around them. So they might learn that, when I cry, somebody comes and checks that I'm all right. And so looking after Bea, over the weekend when if she walked into it, she can walk, and if she walks into another room and there's no one around, she cries, and lo and behold, myself or somebody else in my family will come and find her and bring her back to everybody. She doesn't like being alone, and she's worked out she can communicate with us. So you can see from the picture too that she's learning about the world through putting objects in her mouth and tasting them, which is the classic learning strategy for that age group. Now this is Franklin, he's my nephew, and he is 5 years old. So he's at what Piaget termed the pre-operational stage, and the major characteristics and developmental changes is that children learn to think symbolically and learn to use words and pictures to represent objects. So when you're teaching a child who's less than 2, 1.5, for example, about an object, you're showing them the object. You're getting them to touch. Look, here's a leaf. There's the dog. There's the cat. But when children are between 2 and 6, you can start showing them pictures, and they're learning to think abstractly and symbolically. Children at this stage tend to be egocentric and struggle to see things from the perspective of others. So it's their world, it's their worldview. Everything revolves around them. They're getting better at language and thinking, but they still tend to think about things in very concrete terms. So while they're getting some of that symbolic learning around what signs mean, what pictures mean, what they refer to, they still think, take things quite literally and think very concretely. And they become very skilled at pretend play during this stage of development. And this play is actually one of the ways that they're learning about the world. So the younger children learning about the world through tasting it, touching it. In the sensory motor stage, in the pre-operational stage, children are learning about the world through mimicking what they've seen and trying to make sense of the world through imaginary play. Now, in this picture, we have my son Liam in the middle wearing the mask, and he is 7, so he's at the concrete operational stage sometimes. And you can see on either side of him his teenage brother and sister, and he's not allowed to play the board game because it's not suitable for small children. And so his idea of playing is putting on a mask and disrupting the game, while the teenagers are demonstrating their ability to reason abstractly and think hypothetically. So Liam, who is in the concrete operational stage, uses symbols and words and images to represent objects, but it doesn't mean he reasons logically. And he also understands conservation, which is that if we have an amount of liquid in a long tall cup, it will be equal. So if we have an amount of liquid in a short wide cup and we transfer that into a tall skinny glass, that they understand that the water is conserved and it's the same amount in a different shape. But before the concrete operational stage, in the pre-operational stage, children think that the taller one has more water. They don't understand that the water is conserved. Children Liam's age, their thinking becomes more logical and organised, but it's still quite concrete. And they begin to use inductive logic or to reason from specific information to draw conclusions or to think about a general principle. So even though they can still be literal and concrete in their thinking, they're able to extend and think about things beyond what they've experienced, and they become better at understanding how other people might view a particular situation. So babysitting Franklin over the weekend with Liam, there was a bit of clashes because, of course, the 7-year-old can understand the 5-year-old's point of view, but the 5-year-old doesn't necessarily understand the 7-year-old's point of view, and the 7-year-old's games rules seem unnecessarily complicated for the 5-year-old. So you have that clash because their understanding of the world is a little different. And then the teenagers, post 12 years old, are in the formal operational stages. So they can think abstractly, reason about hypothetical problems, abstract thought emerges. They begin to think more about moral, philosophical, ethical, social and political issues that require theoretical and abstract reasoning. So my daughter goes online, gets in fights with people because of the current stage of ethical and political and moral reasoning, and that she's drawn particular conclusions about the world and is quite prepared to argue on the internet with strangers about it, in that the passion that teenagers have. young people that age begin to use deductive logic or reasoning from a general information to specific information, from general principle to specific information. So the ability to think about abstract ideas and situations is the key hallmark of the formal operational stage of cognitive development. The ability to systematically plan for the future and reason about hypothetical situations are also critical abilities that emerge during this stage. Now, Piaget didn't view children's intellectual development as a quantitative process. He was not arguing in this stage model that it's just a matter of adding more knowledge and it's a certain volume of knowledge that marks the difference between the stages. He was arguing that these stages are all qualitatively different, that children are thinking differently when they get to the next stage. And it's a gradual process of moving their way through those stages from birth to teens. And what he's arguing is that a child at 7 doesn't just have more information about the world than he did at 4. There's a fundamental difference in how he thinks about the world. And this was Piaget's big legacy, because previous to that it was believed that children were just smaller versions of adults who knew less, and that learning just involved kind of adding more knowledge. But Piaget was one of the first to provide a clear articulation of that it's different, that knowledge is learnt in different ways at these different stages, and that the thinking is different and the worldview is different and the level of understanding is different. And so a lot of the way that children are taught is based on understanding which of these stages of cognitive development that they're at. So, for example, if you go to an early childhood centre and you're not to 2 room, there's a lot of sensory learning, sensory experiences set up for the children to learn about the world. In the pre-operational stage, there's lots of images. Children are taught with lots and lots of pictures and lots of tactile things. So maths lessons might involve playing with blocks and building blocks and putting the blocks together rather than just working with the numbers. So they're also helping the children to understand in a concrete way. And then as you move through the school years, the learning becomes more theoretical based and more abstract, because as students develop cognitively, they no longer need the concrete stimulus material and to help them with the learning. They can think about things abstractly. So the very way that we set up and structure our curriculum is based on these ideas that children's cognitive development changes as they grow older, and we can teach them in different ways. So we now turn to Kohlberg and his theory of moral development. And Kohlberg developed this theory as an application of Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So he thought that just in the way that as you grow older, the way you learn about the world changes and the types of reasoning you're capable of changes. He thought that as you get older, the way you understand morality and the moral choices you make changes, and that you think differently. Your moral thinking changes as you hit different stages. So the first stage in his theory is the obedience punishment stage. And that's at infancy, where there's no difference between doing the right thing and avoiding punishment. You just you're not good. You just try not to get punished. Then preschoolers are in the self-interested phase, where their interest shifts from getting rewards rather than being punished. So instead of trying to avoid punishment, you're trying to do the right thing. So you might get stickers. So sticker charts and lollies and a bit of bribery is believed by Kohlberg to match where young people are at that stage. Then school-age children go through conformity and interpersonal accord, which is the kind of good boy, good girl level, and children are trying to secure approval and maintain friendly relations with this one. So there's often children trying to please their teachers. That is the type of behaviour that you'll see at this one. They're tying in being good to their sense of self. And the second stage in that is the authority and social order, which is another school age stage, where the orientation is towards fixed rules, and we follow the rules so that social order can be maintained, and our idea of interpersonal accord is expanded to include the entire society. And we can see children, when they start hitting this fixed rule stage, as being the little police people, and they're policing each other's behaviour, and they have acute awareness of the rules. And then teenagers develop a sense of the social contract, which is about principles such as mutual benefit and reciprocity. And they develop an understanding that morally right and legally right are not always the same. And it can be underpinned by the utilitarian rules that make life better for everyone. So we all stop at traffic lights, even though we might be personally disadvantaged, but we know that even if it's 4 o'clock in the morning and going through the light, we're not going to hit anybody, but we're maintaining the social contract that makes the road safer if we all follow this rule. And then the last stage in Kohlberg's theory of moral development is universal principles, which people attain in adulthood, and that said that morality is based on principles that transcend mutual benefit. So it's not just we might not have a morality that benefits both parties, but a morality that understands that can be self-effacing, and it's about everybody, it doesn't necessarily personally benefit somebody. And Kohlberg's theory is often presented as being a hierarchy, with the post-conventional theories of the social contract and the universal principles sitting at the top, the law and order morality and good boy, good girl attitude sitting in the middle, the self-interest and avoiding punishment are at the bottom. And so it's seen that you want students to work through up to the pinnacle of these post-conventional forms of moral reasoning. So you have moral reasoning based on personal ethics, whereas the conventional stages are based on external ethics, and the early stages are based on reward and punishment. And there is some critique around things like that maybe not everybody is going to reach post-conventional morality. And when we say, for example, in the social contract, utilitarian rules make life easier for everybody, the benefit for everyone at the expense of the few has actually been a rule that's caused a lot of social harm in particular contexts. So there has been some critique of Kohlberg's theory, and I'll unpack them a little bit more at the end of the lecture. But his theories haven't been empirically proven. So studies with children and decision making found that if we talked to children about their choices they would make about their health, that 14-year-olds would make the same moral choices as adults and give similar reasoning, and a 9-year-old often would make the same choice as well, but not necessarily be able to articulate the reasons behind it. So the age range is not necessarily accurate and not necessarily reflected in people's reasoning capability when we present them with moral dilemmas and do empirical research to see how people actually reason through this sort of thing. And so now we're going to change direction and look at Vygotsky's ideas around the socio-cultural world and its impact on cognitive development. And Vygotsky's big insight was that learning is not just something that occurs in school, that it's hugely influenced by somebody's culture. And by culture, he wasn't just talking about the culture of the school, but the wider culture that surrounds the student, their home, church, the government, the media, and culture has a massive impact on learning, and it even shapes how you learn. And that in turn is shaped by language, because language is the root of culture. So there's a lot of trite examples around how, for example, the Inuit people might have 27 words for snow because in their culture snow is so important. Now that example is not necessarily true, but it's the type of thing that gets passed around to illustrate the fact that how we speak, how we think influences how we speak, and the words we have for a particular thing. And so some languages have words for experiences that don't exist in other languages. And so that it shapes what learning is possible, because it's very hard to learn something if you don't have a word for it, if in your culture that particular thing doesn't exist. And Vygotsky also added that individuals learn and develop their role within their community. So their learning is not just what happens in school, it's also how they fit into the social world, the pecking order, And so his insights were that you can't take a particular education system and push it out as a mass system, because then you're ignoring the impact of culture and the impact of language underpinning that culture, and the role of individuals within their communities. So his views on learning were quite almost radical when initial education theories were based on ideas around Skinner's reward and punishment. So he's taking learning as being a much bigger thing than what goes on between the student and the teacher. And his theories become the basis of socio-constructivism, this idea that it's through social processes that we construct our understanding of the world. And his legacy is that he wanted others to realise that there's a complex relationship between culture and human development, and it's a cycle. So at the same time that culture is influencing the individual is in turn creating culture. And we say that about the education system, that while society creates a particular type of education system, that education system in turn can shape society. And previously to Vygotsky, it was more thought that the education system shaped the individual, but there wasn't the sense that the individual is creating culture while culture is influencing the individual. So he sees learning as a dynamic that affects the individuals, the context in which they're learning, and the wider socio-context, and that has a huge impact on what's possible in terms of learning. One of the theories of Vygotsky's that's become a big part of education is this concept of the zone of proximal development. And that says that if you scaffold people appropriately, you can extend their range of learning. So if you can see in the purple circle, it's what someone currently understands and what they can do unassisted without support. And the zone of proximal development is how far you can take their learning if you give them the appropriate support or the appropriate scaffold. So if you think of the idea of an apprentice, for example, an apprentice will come to their apprenticeship with a limited number of skills and knowledge. And if you said to them, okay, now do this task, the only so far they could go. And through the process of extending their learning, through teaching them practically and theoretically, they emerge through the apprenticeship and are able to be, do that particular role in their own right. But there'll be some things that they are never able to learn, and that's what's out of reach. However, through a cycle, you can take the zone through so they can learn what was initially out of reach from their starting point. So zone of proximal development is not just this the space where what a learner can learn through scaffolding. It's also a series of cycles that takes the learner from a very limited knowledge through to a much fuller knowledge over repetitive recursive loops. So in the first stage, the learner they have a particular capacity, so they're in this space. And then through the zone of proximal development, through being assisted by MKOs, more knowledgeable others, like teachers, for example, or tutors, and in the assistance they provide by themselves, then we've extended their learning. Their capacity has developed. Now, the third stage is automating what they've learned. So through practice, through keep training, through. So here we have a football example. So the coach teaches them how to throw. They're reading about particular plays, and then through repeated training, drills, practice, it becomes automatic. And then the fourth stage is you've hit the knowledge of what you know. We need to learn more and extend you. So we're going out of automatic and we're into a new learning phase, and we're back here. Your capacity is not where it was. It's somewhere here now. We're going to take it out here through these processes all over again. So it's a recursive loop that keeps students learning through scaffolding them from where they are at a given point of time to the limits of where you can go with those scaffolds. Okay, so now we've had a whirlwind theory. We've looked at educational psychology. We've looked at some of the main messages that educational psychologists have given to teachers. And now we've just had a whirlwind tour of 3 foundational theories. Okay, so the problem with these theories is they were created at the beginning of the 20th century and are underpinned by early 20th century science assumptions. So the early 20th century science tended to be very masculine, had this idea of objectivity, had particular racial ideas about the white race and white science being supreme. And even though the knowledge base was built on by taking knowledge from other cultures and incorporating them into the dominant culture, there was still a sense that certain ways of thoughts and certain theories of knowledge were dominant, and these underpinned these particular theories. And it tends to be that the people theorizing, Kohlberg, Piaget, Vygotsky, the wealthy class. So they're using their experience, universalizing this experience and making it the basis of a theory that can be applied to everybody. So when we look at stage-based theories such as Piaget or Kohlberg's, it's context-free. It's said to be able to work in any context. And so these theories have been critiqued by feminists, for example, by critical race scholars, and and also by psychology itself, which states that, that yes, okay, students do learn. You can't teach a 12-year-old what you can't teach a 2-year-old what you can teach a 12-year-old, but it doesn't mean that students necessarily go through those stages in a linear, unproblematic way. That actually learning can be back and forth. You can go in cycles. You can know something, and then you have to keep practicing, or you've lost it, or you have a regression. And so these theories are a starting point, not for discussion, for thinking, for planning. They're not the end point. We don't have to absolutely consider that every adult that we meet is going to be post-conventional in their morality, and that every child is going to be conventional going through the policeman stage. So the kind of message here is it is worth learning these foundational theories and to understand them, because they are the basis of so much of curriculum development and curriculum theory. But also when we working with children, it's always a lot more complex than what some framework is going to say. And so the framework is a starting point. It's not the end point. It's not the be all and end all. So if you want more information about those theories, you can work through the online materials that are on Blackboard. They unpack them and explain them with little videos, which is probably better than hearing my voice. I've also got for you here the report that I referred to with those top 20 principles. The link here, the Ed Interactive org, shows uses Piaget's stages of development to show how the types of learning that you would give to students in those particular stages. There's also on Blackboard, if you're really interested in neurological development, there's a lecture by one of my colleagues looking at neurological development. And so that's available, and some readings associated with that if you're very interested in how brains work and what can go wrong in those processes. And we'll continue looking at this topic next week, looking at physiological development as well as social and emotional development and how they all impact on students' learning. So I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I look forward to catching up with you later. And I'm just going to cheekily say, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. But I'm only joking. Isn't that just what you say at the end of every YouTube video clip these days? See ya.